Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. Affirmative action has taken center stage in the current political debate. Now, is affirmative action necessary to correct historical wrongs against minorities and women, or is it a racial and gender spoil system that is dividing America? Where do we go from here? Joining us to sort through the conflict and consensus are Glenn Loury, professor of economics at Boston University and author of One by One from the Inside Out, Ronald Walters, chairman of the political science department at Howard University, Linda Chavez, president of the Center for Equal Opportunity and author of Out of the Barrio, Toward a New Politics of Hispanic Assimilation, and Christopher Edley Jr., professor at Harvard University School of Law, who recently headed President Clinton's task force on affirmative action. The topic before this House: does affirmative action divide us or unite us? This week on Think Tank. Affirmative action, as now practiced, is under assault. Several recent Supreme Court decisions have limited the extent of affirmative action. But last week, President Clinton weighed in favor of affirmative action, albeit with some Clinton-esque caveats, which will be discussed later.
If affirmative action has worked, and if there is evidence that discrimination still exists on a wide scale, in ways that are conscious and unconscious, then why should we get rid of it, as many people are urging? We should have a simple slogan: mend it, but don't end it. But let me be clear. Affirmative action has been good for America.
The president's speech sparked reactions, both positive and negative. First, the Democrats. Mr. Clinton was praised by District of Columbia delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton and by Jesse Jackson, sort of.
Bill Clinton showed that he had the guts to stand up and lead the American people out of their polarization.
Today he stuck his finger in the dike, but the flood waters are rising.
As for the Republicans, presidential candidates, Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole and California Governor Pete Wilson, were not impressed.
You do not cure the evil of discrimination with more discrimination.
He says that he is opposed to quotas, but favors preferences. That's a distinction without a difference.
Led by Governor Wilson, the California Board of Regents, which oversees California state universities, rolled back racial preferences for college admissions. The vote was met with angry protests led by Jesse Jackson. According to most projections, if academic achievement were the sole criterion used for admission, the number of Black and Hispanic students at the University of California at Berkeley would drop sharply. White students would increase a bit, and the number of Asian students would go up dramatically. Lady and gentlemen, let us begin with one quick go-around on this sort of elemental question. President Clinton said that affirmative action has been good for America. Linda Chavez, is he right?
I think he's wrong, because affirmative action means racial preferences today, and that most decidedly has been bad for America.
Okay, Ron Walters.
I think certainly affirmative action has been good. You really have to ask the people who have benefited from it, the millions of women, the millions of minorities, and I think that they would give you a resounding yes.
All right, Glenn Loury.
What's been good for America is the concern about racial inequality. There was a time when affirmative action, I think, necessarily advanced that concern, but that time has passed.
And Chris Edley.
Well, I agree with what Glenn said, except for the last phrase. I don't think the time is over. We still do need affirmative action, but that doesn't mean it should be immune from reform or that we shouldn't fight abuses.
All right, to those of you, Linda, I guess particularly, was affirmative action important and useful when it was originally conceived?
Well, the original intent of affirmative action was to cast a wider net and to provide skills and training in order to allow those who'd been kept out in the past to be able to compete, to bring them up to speed so that they could compete under the same rules and standards as everyone else. And I think it was very necessary. I think it was part of the whole change and shift that took place beginning in the 1960s when we passed our non-discrimination laws. The problem was that it did, in fact, modify over the years, and by the time that President Nixon was in office, you had affirmative action being turned into programs that granted preference on the basis of race and that employed numerical numbers in order to try and essentially force employers and other sectors of our public institutions to hire people by the number, to select people by race.
Okay, right, wrong, what Linda says?
Yes, I think she certainly is wrong. I knew Sam Jackson, who was the first director of the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission.
Now,
and I remember
you were staff director.
I was director of the Civil Rights Commission of President Reagan.
Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ron.
And I remember talking to Sam, and he was commiserating that this first commission had very few teeth to do anything, and that the first time he got a chance, he was going to go back to Congress to see if they couldn't get it. So I'm happy that a Republican President, Nixon, came along and said, well, we have a principle in Title VII. What we need is implementation mechanism. And if you hadn't had successive presidents to issue executive orders and to do those kind of things to actually make it work, it would have been very similar to what we have in Brazil, a principle which really would be meaningless.
Glenn?
Well, I think there are a couple of things here. One is to distinguish between anti-discrimination enforcement efforts, which sometimes, of necessity, in my opinion, require attention to numerical information, on the one hand, and every group deserves their proportionate piece of the pie thinking, which is clearly what's behind the set aside of government procurement to businesses identified by the color or the sex of the people who own a majority interest in them. It has become quite divisive and costly politically, costly to the interest of African Americans, and I think costly to this Democratic president, as he's going to learn in due course.
All right. Speaking of this Democratic president, he too has dealt with these criteria and the nuances. Let's just cut for a moment to one more bite of President Clinton's recent speech, and then let's talk about that.
Today, I am directing all our agencies to comply with the Supreme Court's Adarand decision and also to apply the 4 standards of fairness to all our affirmative action programs that I have already articulated. No quotas in theory or practice, no illegal discrimination of any kind, including reverse discrimination, no preference for people who are not qualified. Any program that doesn't meet these 4 principles must be eliminated or reformed to meet them.
Chris Edley, let me ask you a question. Because so much of this whole discussion and argument going on about affirmative action in the country is in how you define various terms. Suppose this very speech was delivered by Governor Wilson, or by Bob Dole, or by Pat Buchanan, the same speech. Would you fear for the continued use of affirmative action?
That's a great question.
Thank you.
No, really, it is, and I think. Let me answer it this way. I've been asked by some reporters and talk show callers in the days of the speech to try to elaborate a little on at least my understanding of what the president has in mind. When he says, for example, a program should end or be reformed if it creates reverse discrimination, the question is, what does he mean by reverse discrimination?
And what does he mean by ending? What does he mean by ending? Yeah.
Right. What he means by reverse discrimination is essentially the same test that the Supreme Court discussed in the Adarand case. So that there is built into that, sort of incorporated by reference, this issue of justification. For example, is there a predicate of prior discrimination, as well as narrow tailoring. The difficulty with some of the harsh opponents of affirmative action is that they are not where 7 out of 9 justices of the Supreme Court are on the issue, but they are instead where Justice Thomas and Justice Scalia are, namely feeling that any kind of distinction based on race is constitutionally prohibited, rather than recognizing that there are some distinctions that may be critical, at least for remedial purposes, and possibly for purposes of inclusion as well.
One of the things I find myself frustrated about whenever these discussions begin is that we talk in very theoretical terms. We have some real knowledge about how these programs work in specific institutions. University of California at Berkeley, for example, has had an affirmative action program in place for many years. Now, the original University of California system of quotas was in fact struck down by the Bakke decision back in the late 1970s. And since then, they've moved towards a diversity standard, taking into account Bakke and saying that they could in fact make race a factor in selection. How has that operated? Well, I'll tell you how it's operated. At Cal, you have students who are Asians who are being admitted.
At Cal?
At
meaning?
University of California at Berkeley.
Right.
Are admitted with SAT scores that are 300 points higher than those black students who are admitted under affirmative action programs. Moreover, the Asian students have to have a grade point average, which is half a point higher. They come in with a 3.9 average, black students come in with a 3.4 average. And there are similar disparities between whites and Hispanics. Hispanics are midway sort of between where whites and blacks are on this scale. What that means is that we are applying double standards, and those double standards are being applied on the basis of race.
I think what you've got here really, though, when you look at this at the end of the day, these four principles, when applied, probably would mean that there would be very few of these programs eliminated because there are no quotas and on and on and on and on. So I think that what the president has done is to set out a standard which meets the public dialogue and the problems that the public has with these programs. But at the end of the day, these programs are going to stand. With respect to the California system, I think she talks about this has created sort of a problem of double standard. There is no university in the United States that admits strictly on the basis of these scores, because universities have different
University
objectives.
of California under the Wilson standard, so you'd still have about 50% of the people, 40%.
Absolutely.
Right.
So this is not a situation where the objectives of universities and looking at the diversity of their student bodies can be achieved simply by reference to these scores.
Ron,
there are superordinate objectives here in American higher education, and I think we ought to keep that in mind.
But Ron, let me just make one more point. The distinction is that we ought to have one set of rules, and it ought to apply to all persons without regard to their race, their color, or their gender. And if the university wants to take into account other things, including socioeconomic conditions, I think that's fine.
Which it does.
But it ought to be the same rules, and race and color and gender ought not to be the basis for different rules and double standards.
Let's bring Boston into
that.
Let Boston give a shot here.
I think the problem here is that we're not being entirely honest about what's at stake. From my point of view, some concern for racial diversity in a college class is a legitimate interest of the institution.
Hallelujah.
If they were going to have 0 black and Hispanic, or 0.5% at Berkeley, if they went strictly by test scores and they said, we can't live with that because we're really doing a disservice to our students by constituting a community so unreflective of the world in which they'll have to function, I would regard that as a reasonable statement. Now, the question becomes this: what price will I pay to indulge my legitimate interest in diversity in terms of a disparity in the measures of academic ability of the students that I admit? 50 points on an SAT when the average score is 1,200 is a reasonable price to pay. That's comparable to the price that universities pay in order to indulge the sons and daughters of alumni in their admissions process, in order to ensure that they get geographic diversity, that they recruit athletes and musically talented youngsters into their communities. Why not also that degree of indulgence after the legitimate interest of racial and ethnic diversity? 250, 300 points, that's too big.
And that's what it is now, according to...
That's what it is, and if you indulge the 50-point difference, you might end up with 4% instead of 10% minority in a class. We can live with that, and you've still got some diversity.
Let me be the skunk at the garden party here and bring up the P word, which is politics. Now, the president said in the middle of his speech, it's just dreadful to play politics with this, and one paragraph later, he was there pounding on the Republicans for being bad guys and starving children and whatever. Ron Walters, you used to be an advisor to Reverend Jesse Jackson. Now, inside this particular beltway, as people look at the political spin of this particular speech, They are saying that what the president really was doing politically was to freeze Jesse, which is to say, I'm going to come out with a speech that everybody is going to interpret to be very much pro-affirmative action. That takes Jesse Jackson's issue away from him. He cannot, should not, would not start a third party to run against me, which would ensure the election of Pete Wilson or Robert Dole or whoever. True or not true?
Well, I think that Jesse may be thawing, but it's certainly not frozen. I think because I think because when you look at some of the problems I think that he has with the administration, I think they're valid. As we sit, we're just about to go into 1996 elections. We still don't have an urban policy of any dimension. When you look at the nature of his crime bill, it's still lock them up, throw them away, build prisons, 100,000 police on the street, lock them up.
All the things I approve of.
All of the things that you approve of, yes. And so it really does sound kind of Republican. And so I think that what we really do need is a Democrat in the White House who respects the political coalition that elected him. And I don't think we're quite there yet with this president. And so I think the viability of that party option is still very real.
I see Chris in Boston is smiling. Now, you wrote a piece in the Outlook section that said, heaven forfend that there was any politics whatsoever involved in the actual creation of the report. And if you said it, I'm sure it's true. But would you say that the report notwithstanding, this particular White House was particularly attuned to the political impact?
Not true. Well, would be attuned to the political impact. I mean, do people pay attention to politics? Of course. But were political calculations at work in crafting the policy or the report? The answer
or the
to that
speech.
Or the speech. The answer is no. What was at work, I think, was moral calculation, not political calculation. What was at work was a sense that unless the president could speak clearly about this issue, it would be impossible to try to lead a national conversation. Ben, you disappoint me deeply. I mean,
well,
I know inside the Beltway, I understand that it's a one-industry town, but I know it's more difficult to talk about what's right and wrong versus who's up and who's down.
Well, we just did talk about what's right and wrong, but a couple of months ago, the spin coming from the White House is, boy, we are really going to reform affirmative action and the angry white male and all that kind of stuff. And then there were all the stories of the Congressional Black Caucus and the civil rights community coming in and banging up on President Clinton's head.
But look,
and then out comes the speech, and you're saying no relationship.
No, look, first of all, the spin was misreported. None of the people, the handful of people who were meeting week in and week out with the president and the vice president, discussing this policy, formulating the report, were sitting around in the Oval Office discussing polls or focus groups or who the Republican nominee is going to be or what Jesse Jackson.
No, that's what Richard Morris was doing after you left.
Look,
with the president.
It's the fact of the matter is, for exactly the reason that you pundits like to talk about the politics so much, the politics is indeterminate here. The arrows point in every direction. It's a waste of time.
Ben, I have to tell you, I think that Chris Adley's motives were absolutely pure. I think Bill Clinton played an almost Machiavellian role here. I think the speech a couple of months ago, basically dangling out the prospect that he was going to take away these programs, was done to make people nervous. And then he put Chris Adley in charge and others in charge who were very much pro-affirmative action. He knew exactly where he wanted to end up. And what he did is he had all of the civil rights community very nervous and now very beholden to him because he saved their
program. But it was the right thing to do. Everybody was nervous because we were asking, at the president's insistence, hard questions, and they were the right questions.
A majority of Americans don't agree with you.
But the answers are what they are.
The political problems that Jesse Jackson has and that Ron Walters has with Bill Clinton are really not problems with Bill Clinton, they're problems with the American people. I think the president probably will pay a political price for what he has done in the general election, although he probably got some political benefit out of it in terms of shorter-term Democratic Party politics calculation. But the bottom line here is that affirmative action is unpopular. Pete Wilson has got an issue. I would much rather be in his position as a political operative than in the position of trying to paint him as a demagogue for using the issue when in fact most people agree with him on the fundamentals.
Now, as the ranking Machiavellian here, let me give you one more twist on this, which is as follows. Everything plays out as you all just said, and then at about a year from now or 9 months from now or 13 months from now, when you get into the general campaign, particularly if Reverend Jackson is not in the race, at that point, President Clinton pulls out these 4 points. He says, remember, I was going to police this stuff, and I have eliminated more phony baloney affirmative action. You should have seen what Reagan and Bush, and when Linda Chavez was in the Civil Rights Office, you should see the abuses that they allowed, and I am the guy who cleaned up affirmative action. That, how does that ring for some politics?
Well, I think one of the reasons why some
And
of
then
us
you're going to cry betrayal.
I am going to cry betrayal, and that's one of the reasons why I'm not dancing in the street, because this is more than a one-issue proposition. It's beyond one speech. I want to look and see what the White House does with these 4 principles. I want to see what the agencies do at his direction with these programs. So we've got a long way to go before even the affirmative action chapter is over.
If Bill
Can I make a point here, Bill?
Yeah, one second, let Linda go
If
for
Bill
it.
Clinton wants to move to my right on this issue, I will move over and give him room. I'd be happy to have him there.
We're talking only about the presidential politics. What about the politics of the interests of poor black people? I think those interests have been very poorly served by what amounts to deal making on behalf of an elite black business class who want to keep their sinecure with the federal government's trough, and who, in doing so, are alienating the possibility of any kind of cooperation on behalf of issues that affect the basic livelihood and lives of workaday black folk.
You know,
That analysis is a little bit stale for 2 reasons. Number one, with regard to the contracting and minority businesses and so forth, the Supreme Court has spoken. It is now constitutionally impermissible for these programs, if they ever were racial spoils, proportionality, if they ever were that, which can be sharply disputed, that is now constitutionally impermissible. These programs must meet a constitutional test that requires that they can only exist where there has been and where there continues to be discrimination, and that the programs have to be narrowly tailored. Those programs are remedial, they are not racial spoils.
That's double talk, because
it's not legal double talk, Glenn. It's not a case law.
Because when that Richmond decision came down, every
Yes.
town that wanted to give business to black people went out and hired a consulting firm, sometimes the same firm in Atlanta, Georgia, to prove that they had been discriminating all along, so that now they could hand out their sinecure to the people that they wanted to give it to.
But Glenn,
that's hokum. It's a shell game.
No, Glenn, that's embarrassing. You're a social scientist. They hired social scientists like Ray Marshall, like Andy Brimmer, who went out and did studies that are as thick as telephone books, that did the econometrics, that did the statistics, that did depositions to try to create a factual predicate that could be examined
They knew
by
the answer they wanted to get before they
could be
started.
examined
Hold
by
on
the
for 1
answer
minute.
they wanted to get
Hang
before
on,
they started.
guys.
But that's tested in court.
Up in Boston, hold on 1 minute. I have just appointed each of you President, Congress, and Supreme Court. It's your call. You are dictator for the next 10 years. What would you do about this situation, Chris Edley?
I think the president has charted the right course. It's a course that says we have to continue to make progress, use race, ethnicity, gender, where needed, use it carefully. But most importantly, I think the need is to try to have a discussion that grapples with the heart of the issues, that focuses on the facts, not on the politics.
Okay.
That recognizes that there are moral conflicts here that have to be balanced delicately.
Okay, President Lowry, your turn.
Well, we get rid of the preferences in the main, with very few exceptions.
What's a preference?
Now let him finish.
We focus attention on the development of basic skills and human capacities in the disadvantaged population. We end this stuff about immigrants. Immigrants are not eligible for affirmative action. We kill off the preferential treatment for women. Makes no sense in the contemporary social context. We invest in K through 12 education. We invest in community colleges. And we enforce the anti-discrimination laws vigorously, but we back way off.
President Chavez, yeah.
First of all, I would go back to the original language of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which says it will be illegal to discriminate on the basis of race, color, national origin, or sex. And it also said nothing in this act shall require preference on those bases either. That would be my non-discrimination policy. Then I would spend a lot of money and a lot of effort to try to improve education K through 12, so that kids who go to school in barrios and inner cities across America have a chance to compete on the same standards as everyone else.
President Walters, and how does that sound, President Walters? It's got a nice ring to it.
It does have a very good ring to it. I would not confuse the things that go wrong with affirmative action, such as firms that are not truly minority firms. I would prosecute those to the limit of the law. They are fraud, not affirmative action. So yes, I would reform it, and I'd take the problems out of it. But I certainly, at the end of the day, think we need some regime Americans have not been kind, I think, in this area. We're not able yet to depend upon the voluntarism of our institutions. So we still need something.
Okay, well, I want to thank our four presidents in Boston, Glenn Loury and Christopher Edley Jr., here in Washington, Ron Walters and Linda Chavez, and thank you. Please send your questions and comments to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. We can be reached via email at thinktv@aol.com, and do check out our new homepage on the World Wide Web at www.thinktank.com. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.